It started with an online job listing. Nothing special. Just another late-night security shift. The pay was generous. Suspiciously generous. Overnight security needed. Isolated location. No experience required. Cash payment. It didn't ask for references. Didn't even require an interview at first. Just an address and a time. 10 p.m. sharp. When I arrived, the place was in worse shape than I expected. I pulled up to a rusted metal gate, hanging open like someone had forced their way in or out. A faded wooden sign stood at the entrance, barely legible under years of rain and neglect. Everbrook Retirement Home, closed since 1987. It didn't make sense. If the place had been abandoned for decades, why did it still need a security guard? The rain drummed against my windshield. My wipers smeared the glass instead of clearing it, making the darkened building ahead look even less welcoming. It was a massive, looming structure, its windows either shattered or boarded up. Some had thick curtains drawn shut. Strange, considering the building was supposed to be empty. The job posting had mentioned nothing about Everbrook's history. I hadn't looked into it beforehand. Maybe I should have, but I was broke. Rent was overdue, and I was already here. As I stepped out of my car, the rain was colder than I expected, seeping through my jacket within seconds. The front gate groaned as I nudged it open further, the metal screeching in protest. It sounded wrong, like it hadn't been moved in a long time. Or worse, like it had been closed for a reason. I turned, and I could see nothing behind me. Just an empty driveway, weeds pushing through cracked pavement. The security booth at the entrance was dark, abandoned. The only sign that someone had been there recently was a lit cigarette, still smoldering on the booth's ledge. I was being watched. Or at least, someone had been here just moments before I arrived. The front doors were unlocked. No receptionist, no welcome desk. Just a wide, gaping entrance leading into darkness. My footsteps echoed as I stepped inside, swallowed by the quiet. The air was heavy, stale. It smelled of dust and something else. Something chemical, almost metallic. And underneath it, something rotten. I reached for the light switch out of habit. It didn't work. Then, behind me, the doors slammed shut. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The doors hadn't just closed. They had locked. I hadn't touched them. I stood frozen, heart pounding. My first instinct was to run, to turn around and pry those doors open, with everything I had. But then, a sound echoed through the empty halls. Footsteps. They were deliberate. Slow, coming from deeper inside the building. I wasn't alone, and yet, when I called out, my voice was the only one that answered. No response, no movement, just silence. I swallowed hard, pushing forward. The contract said my shift would start in 5 minutes, and my new boss was waiting. Then, out of nowhere, a huge man appeared, holding a cigar in his hand. "Follow me if you are here for the job." His voice was a bit cold and detached, as if he was expecting someone else, and not me. The office was smaller than I expected. No windows, no clocks. Just a heavy wooden desk and a single chair positioned in front of it. The man sitting across from me was older, wearing a neatly pressed suit that looked out of place in a building that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. His tie was knotted too tightly, his hands folded neatly on the desk. He didn't look up when I entered, just kept writing in a thick ledger, the tip of his pen scratching against the paper in slow, deliberate strokes. For a moment, I considered turning around. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "You're late." His voice was calm, Even. Not irritated. Just flat. Sorry, I muttered, shifting on my feet. The doors, closed behind me. Yes, they do that. I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. Instead, he reached into a drawer, pulled out a stack of yellowed papers, and slid them toward me. Read. Sign. The contract was strange. The first page looked normal enough. Basic employment terms. An hourly wage that was far too high for what was essentially a night watch position. But as I flipped through, my stomach twisted. The rules weren't normal. Do not disturb the residents. Do not respond to any voices after 2 a.m. Do not enter the locked wing under any circumstances. I swallowed hard. Is this some kind of joke? I asked, forcing a laugh. The man's expression didn't change. It's standard policy. I hesitated, but before I could push further, he slid something else across the desk. An ID badge. It already had my name on it. And the date. Tonight's date. I hadn't told them I was coming. I hadn't even officially accepted the job yet. But they had already been expecting me. Your shift starts now, the man said, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor as he moved past me, reaching for the office door. I should have left. I should have torn that contract in half and walked out the way I came. But I didn't, because the moment he opened the door, I saw it. A second ID badge. The same name as mine. Same photo. But dated from 3 nights ago. And I wasn't here 3 nights ago. I barely had time to process it before the office door creaked open further, revealing the hallway beyond. Dimly lit. Empty. Or at least, it should have been. But standing there, just beyond the glow of the flickering security light, someone was watching. And they didn't move. They just stood there, staring back at me. I immediately rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. Like just disappeared. There was something off about the air in Everbrook. Not just the smell, though the heavy, stale odor of dust and something faintly metallic clung to the back of my throat, like it had been waiting there for years. It was something else. The quiet. A silence that wasn't just empty, but expectant. I sat in the security office, staring at the wall of old monitors stacked in front of me. The CCTV system was ancient, the kind that still ran on thick, humming wires. Most of the screens were covered in static, nothing but white noise flickering in jagged waves. But some of them worked. And what they showed didn't make sense. The west corridor, empty, lined with rusting wheelchairs that hadn't been used in decades. The dining hall, a massive room filled with overturned chairs and rotting tables, long abandoned. The old patient rooms, doorways ajar, showing nothing but dark, empty beds. But then, something moved. I leaned forward. My chair creaked beneath me. It was faint, just a shadow flickering across one of the working screens. A shift in the dim lighting, there and gone in an instant. It could have been a trick of the old cameras, maybe a rat skittering past. But then, it happened again. This time, in a different hallway. I sat there, staring at the grainy black and white feed, my pulse suddenly too loud in my ears. The static from the broken monitors hissed softly around me, filling the office with the sound of distorted nothingness. Then, through the crackling audio, I heard it. A voice. Not from the monitors, not from the halls, from right above me. Help me. I froze. The intercom speaker in the corner of the office had been dead when I got here. I was sure of it. The wires had been frayed. The speaker itself caked in years of dust. But now it was on. And playing something it shouldn't have been playing. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. Just a faint, pleading whisper, hidden beneath layers of static, like someone was trapped just beyond the speaker's range. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. Hello? My own voice sounded too loud in the empty room. No response, just more static. Then, suddenly, music. The voice cut out, replaced by the crackling, warbled notes of an old song. A wartime melody, the kind you'd expect to hear drifting from a record player in some forgotten dance hall. It was soft, almost gentle at first, but something about it sent a sharp, ice-cold sensation crawling down my spine. I could feel it in my teeth, the way the notes wavered and bent as if the song wasn't being played through the intercom, but coming from somewhere deep inside the building, somewhere that shouldn't have had power. I turned back to the monitors, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my fingers ached. The music played on, filling the empty halls with its eerie, distorted tune. Then, on one of the screens, movement. Not just a flicker. Not a shadow. Something rolling slowly across the hallway floor. A wheelchair. My breath hitched. It wasn't being pushed. There was no one there. But it was moving. Rolling down the empty hall at an agonizingly slow pace, as if something unseen had just nudged it forward. I shot up from my chair, my heartbeat hammering. Every instinct screamed at me to turn off the monitors, to stop watching, to pretend I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. But I didn't move. I just stood there, watching. The wheelchair finally came to a stop. And then it turned. Not sharply, not like it hit something and changed course. It turned deliberately, as if it had just noticed I was watching. And in that moment, every screen cut to static at once. I stumbled back, knocking into the chair behind me. The old song on the intercom stuttered, slowing to a sickening, warped drawl before cutting out completely. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't empty. This time it felt like something was listening. Something that knew I was here. Something upstairs. I didn't hear it at first. Maybe I was too caught up in the eerie stillness that had settled over the security office. Or maybe my mind simply refused to process the sound. But when I did hear it, I wished I hadn't. Footsteps. Software unrushed, moving above me. I looked up instinctively, as if expecting to see through the ceiling. I didn't. But the footsteps continued. One slow, deliberate step after another, shifting the dust that had long since settled in the forgotten upper levels of Everbrook. The patient rooms were up there, and according to the manager, no one was supposed to be. I swallowed hard, my breath slow and shallow. Then, the footsteps stopped, right above my head. And something pressed against the ceiling. A handprint, not an old one. Not a smudge left behind by time and decay. A fresh one, fingers splayed out wide, a palm pressing down directly above where I stood. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just watched. And then it dragged. The handprint moved, sliding slowly across the ceiling like something was crawling just above me, dragging itself toward the hallway. And then the creaking started, the sound of a door opening upstairs. I shouldn't have gone near it. From the moment I stepped into Everbrook, I had been given two simple rules. Don't open the locked doors after midnight, and don't respond to the voices. I had already broken the second rule. And now, standing at the entrance of the West Wing, The one place in this entire building that was explicitly forbidden. I was about to break the first. The doors weren't just locked. They were chained shut. Thick, rusted metal links wrapped around the handles like a makeshift prison, fastened with a padlock so old the numbers had faded off the dial. A brittle, "Do not enter" sign, its edges curled and yellowed with time, hung limply from one of the chains. It should have been enough of a warning. But the thing was, I hadn't meant to come here. I hadn't even realized I had started walking in this direction. One moment, I was still in the security office, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the handprint on the ceiling, that I hadn't really heard something moving upstairs. And the next, I was here, like something had called me. I ran my flashlight along the door, my fingers tightening around the grip. The beam flickered slightly, the batteries already struggling against the cold, damp air of the abandoned building. Then I saw them. The scratches, all along the wood, right beneath where the chains were fastened. Deep, erratic gouges etched into the door frame, as if someone had been clawing at it from the inside. I swallowed, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. These weren't old scratches, not the kind left by years of wear and tear. The wood around them was still rough, still raw, like they had been made recently. Or worse, were still being made. I stepped closer, feeling a prickle of unease skitter up my spine. My breath misted in the air, the temperature around the locked doors noticeably colder than the rest of the hallway. That's when I noticed the filing cabinet. It sat just to the right of the chained doors, tilted slightly to one side, its metal frame covered in dust. One of the drawers was half open, as if someone had been rifling through it in a hurry. I reached out, hesitating only for a second, before pulling it the rest of the way open. Old patient files, dozens of them. Stacks of brittle folders, their edges curling from moisture, each one labeled with a name. Some of them had photos clipped to the inside. I picked one at random. An elderly woman stared back at me, her face thin and hollowed, eyes wide and sunken as if she hadn't slept in weeks. Lillian Carter, room 306, was printed neatly along the top of the file. Room 306. I knew for a fact that room didn't exist anymore. Half the second floor had collapsed years ago, long before Everbrook was officially shut down. I flipped through more of the folders, my unease growing with each one. The dates on these files, they didn't make sense. Some of them were from before Everbrook had been abandoned, but others were after. I grabbed one of the more recent-looking documents, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded it. The ink had smeared in places, but I could still make out most of the handwriting. It wasn't a patient file. It was a logbook, a nurse's record, dated years after the facility had supposedly been shut down. My mouth felt dry as I scanned the last few entries. March 11th, 1989. The West Wing is sealed. It's the only way to keep them contained. March 15th, 1989. God help us. We should have left. We should have burned this place to the ground. March 18th, 1989. They are still here. We locked the doors, but they never left. A loud bang cut through the silence. I dropped the file. My flashlight wobbled in my grip as I whipped toward the chained doors, my breath catching in my throat. Another bang, louder this time. Something on the other side of the doors slammed against them with enough force that the chains rattled violently. My pulse spiked. The air in the hallway grew heavier, pressing in around me like unseen hands gripping my shoulders. I took a shaky step back, heart hammering. The silence stretched. Then, scraping. Low, deliberate. A sound that sent an immediate, primal fear crawling under my skin. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't knocking. It was the sound of something dragging itself across the floor on the other side of the door. Slow, unrelenting. The chains shuddered slightly. A soft, shuffling breath rasped from inside the locked wing. Then, a whisper. Close. Too close. Pressed right against the crack between the doors. You shouldn't be here. The flashlight flickered. The intercom above my head crackled to life. And then all the lights in the hallway went out. Total darkness. And from the other side of the chained doors, something laughed. I couldn't bring myself to move. The darkness around me felt thick, suffocating. The last thing I had seen before the lights went out was the chains rattling on the locked doors. The last thing I had heard was the whisper, the laugh. And now, silence. But not the kind that felt empty. This was something else. Something listening. I forced myself to exhale, slow and controlled, gripping my flashlight tighter. The beam flickered in and out, but I knew I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the dark, something was waiting. Then the intercom crackled, a high-pitched hiss of static that made my ears ring, followed by a low, rasping breath. And then, I see you. My blood ran cold. It was a voice I didn't recognize. I turned sharply toward the sound, heart hammering against my ribs. The speaker was just above the hallway entrance, its old, rusted casing still rattling slightly from the noise. You hear me, don't you? I couldn't answer. Wouldn't. I had already broken too many rules. But the voice, it was so close. The intercom popped again, the distortion cutting in and out, like a bad radio signal struggling to stay tuned. And then, a new voice. My voice. Hello? I froze. Number, that wasn't me. It was me, but it wasn't. I knew exactly what I sounded like. And that was my voice playing over the speaker, echoing down the empty halls. But I had never said those words. Hello? It repeated, softer this time, mocking, like I had said it before, like I'd been talking to something. The flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling to cut through the thick dark of the hallway. Every instinct in my body was screaming to leave, to get back to the security office and lock the doors. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because just then, I saw movement. Down the hall. At first, it was barely noticeable. Just a shift in the shadows. A darker shape within the darkness. Then I saw it. A rocking chair. Sitting just inside one of the empty rooms. Moving. Not wildly. Not violently. Just rocking. Forward. Backward. Forward. Backward. And there was no one in it. I took a slow step back, my shoe scuffing against the dusty tile. The air in the hall had dropped several degrees, cold enough that I could see my own breath in the dim glow of the flashlight. The rocking chair stopped. And then, the door beside it creaked open. I turned away. I was done. I needed to get back to the security office, now. I forced myself to move, to push back the overwhelming dread that clawed at the edges of my mind. I took one step, then two, then three. And then I smelled it. Food. Hot. Fresh. Like it had just been served. My steps slowed. My pulse pounded behind my ears as I turned toward the dining hall. The tables had been empty. I had checked them myself. But now, there was a tray sitting right in the middle of the room, neatly placed, perfectly set. Steam curled upward from the plate. Mashed potatoes, meatloaf, green beans, a full meal, as if someone had just prepared it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, a chair scraped against the floor. A horrible, slow sound, like someone was sitting down. But there was no one there. I backed away, too fast, nearly dropping my flashlight in the process. My feet carried me toward the security office, my mind racing, trying to force logic into something that had no explanation. The food, the chair, the voice. I wasn't alone. They never left. I reached the office door, yanking it open and stumbling inside, my hand fumbling for the light switch. It flickered to life. I turned, and my reflection was smiling at me. The security office had an old, cracked mirror above the desk, but the me in the mirror, it was wrong. It smiled. Wide. Too wide. I took a step back. The reflection didn't move. The smile grew. And then, slowly, it raised a hand and waved. The light went out, and in the darkness, I heard a voice. "Turn around." And from the corner of the room, something moved. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. The things in this place, the whispers, the shadows, the impossible. I had spent the last few nights trying to convince myself they were just echoes of something that used to be here. Ghosts, memories, residual energy. But I had been wrong. Dead wrong. This place wasn't haunted. It was occupied. And the deeper I went, the more I realized this was never just an old retirement home. Everbrook's real history was buried, hidden, erased, but not completely. Somewhere beneath the dust and the rot, the truth was still waiting. And so were they. I don't know what made me go back to the locked wing. Maybe it was the whispering that wouldn't stop, the static-ridden voices that called my name from the intercom. Maybe it was the way the security cameras had started shutting off, one by one, except for one feed. Hallway 4B, the locked doors, the chains. At first I thought it was just static, a glitch, but then, for a split second, I saw something move, and then another, and another. Slow, shuffling shapes, not transparent, not ghosts. People, or at least, they used to be. The chains were moving. The locks were snapping. They were coming out. And they weren't alone. I should have left. I should have walked out the door, left my things behind, and never looked back. But instead, I did the opposite. I grabbed the master key, the one I was never supposed to use, and I unlocked the door. The stench hit me first. Rot, blood. Something else, something wrong. The air was thick, damp, filled with a smell that had soaked into the very walls, like something had been locked away for a long, long time. And then, the hallway. No lights, no windows. Just a long, narrow corridor lined with wheelchairs and hospital beds. And something else. Something moving. My flashlight flickered as I took a step inside. The sound of dripping water echoed somewhere up ahead. Number, not water. Something else. Something wet. The hallway felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The air was thick and stale, filled with the distant scent of something metallic. And then I saw it. The floor hatch. A rusted metal door, just barely visible beneath an old gurney. I stepped closer, the old tile creaking beneath my weight. There was writing on the hatch. Faded. Smudged. barely readable. But as my flashlight beam swept across it, I made out 3 words. Do not open. My breath hitched. I knew I should turn back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out before it was too late. But my hands were already gripping the latch. I pulled. The hatch groaned as it slid open, revealing a staircase leading down into the dark. The underground tunnels weren't on the blueprints. They weren't supposed to be here, but someone had built them. Someone had used them. And from the looks of it, someone had never left. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the concrete walls lined with decaying medical files, broken IV stands, and rusted surgical tools. Old, cracked monitors were mounted to the walls, their screens frozen with static. Some of them still had footage playing, flickering images of patients strapped to hospital beds, of doctors who never looked at the camera, of things that weren't human anymore. I reached for one of the patient files, wiping away a thick layer of dust. The paper crumbled beneath my fingers, the ink smeared with age, but I could still make out the name. Subject 109. Below it, a handwritten note. Do not engage. Do not enter the room. If Subject 109 wakes up, leave immediately. I turned the page, and that's when I saw the photo. A man, or what used to be one. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and stretched too tight over his face. His mouth was open, but his teeth weren't human. They were jagged, sharp. And then I heard the breathing, right behind me. Wet, shuddering, too close. The flashlight flickered. The screen in front of me glitched. The security footage changed. It was live. A grainy, flickering shot of the tunnel hallway. My hallway. And on the screen, there was something standing behind me. Tall. Too tall. Its mouth was hanging wide open. And then the lights all cut out at once. And I felt it. A cold, wet breath on the back of my neck. The breath on my neck wasn't human. It was cold, damp, wrong. Like something had been breathing in the dark for too long, waiting for lungs that never worked, for a body that had stopped moving decades ago. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body told me not to look, not to see, because once you see something like that, it sees you back, and then you're never alone again. I ran. Through the tunnels. Through the dark. The flashlight flickered in my grip, barely holding on to power as my feet slammed against the damp concrete floor. Behind me, something moved. A wet, unnatural shuffle, like limbs bending in ways they weren't meant to, like something crawling. The hallway stretched endlessly, the shadows pressing in, twisting, moving. I kept running, breath ragged, heartbeat hammering in my ears. Somewhere behind me, I heard the scraping. Nails, no, claws, dragging against the walls, getting closer, getting faster, and then, just for a second, the emergency lights flickered on. And I saw it, hanging from the ceiling. Too many limbs, too many joints. A face stretched too wide, mouth hanging open, jaw unhinged. Teeth. So many teeth. It was smiling. The lights went out again. I nearly tripped over my own feet. I wasn't going to make it. It was too fast. I could hear it now, right behind me. The sound of something wet and hungry. And then, a door. Rust-covered, barely hanging on its hinges. I lunged for it, shoved it open, and slammed it shut behind me. The second it closed, the sound stopped. No breathing, no scraping, just silence. Like it was never there at all. But I knew better. It was waiting. It was always waiting. The security office was ahead. I could see the blinking lights of the monitors, the faint glow of the control panel. I had one chance. Get out. Get to the exit. Leave this place behind. I sprinted down the hallway, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I reached the booth, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. Safe. For now. The monitors flickered. Static. Then, a live feed. The underground hallway. I wasn't there anymore, but someone else was, standing right where I had been, a man in a security uniform. But his back was turned. The footage was grainy, but I could see the familiar blue of the shirt, the walkie-talkie strapped to his hip. It looked like me, but I was here. So who was that? The figure on the screen slowly turned. My stomach dropped. The face. It wasn't mine. Its eyes were sunken. Its skin stretched too tight. Its mouth hung open too wide. And then, it smiled. The camera feed cut to static. And behind me, the security booth door unlocked itself. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe until I hit the front door, burst through it, and felt the cold air slap me in the face. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping, heart pounding. The building was silent. The neon sign flickered overhead. Everbrook Retirement Home, closed since 1987. And then, my radio crackled. A voice. My voice. You forgot something. I didn't go back. I never went back.